Remote regions of Asia are enduring brutal persecution while the church he serves has for far too long hesitated to act. That moment when the stark reality could no longer be concealed behind beautifully reconciliatory words forced Luis Antonio Tagle to confront his own conscience. No longer was it a matter of distant dialogues or sterile reports. Tagle understood that the time had come to speak out, to act. And so a major announcement was born, marking the greatest turning point in his pastoral career. A childhood forged by adversity. Born on June 21, 1957 in Manila, Philippines into a devout Catholic family, Luis Antonio Tagle was raised not only on faith but also on vivid lessons of sacrifice, resilience, and overcoming hardship. His father was ethnically Tagalog Filipino, and his mother was of Chinese descent. The family endured heavy losses during the war. His grandfather was gravely wounded by shelling, forcing Tagle's grandmother to support the household alone by running a small eatery. Those stories of struggle, recounted at every family meal, instilled in young Tagle the conviction that faith must be lived out in concrete acts as well as in prayer. That formative backdrop shaped all his subsequent choices. Rather than pursuing a comfortable career in academia or finance, as many bright young Filipinos did, Tagle felt called to the priesthood. He began his ecclesial studies at Ateneo de Manila University in San Jose Seminary. Yet he did not stop there. Tagle went on to the United States to study at the Catholic University of America, where he completed his doctoral dissertation on the theology of communion in the Church. According to Pope Paul VI, his mentor Professor Joseph Kamunchak, a leading theologian, praised Tagle as one of the most incisive and profound students I have ever taught. Far from dulling his pastoral zeal, those years of rigorous scholarship sharpened his critical thinking and deepened his sense of the Church's historical responsibility in a changing world. Returning to the Philippines with his doctorate in hand, Tagle was quickly assigned some of the most demanding tasks, serving as spiritual director for seminarians at the IMU's Diocesan Seminary and teaching theology at prestigious institutions like Divine Word Seminary and St. Carlos Seminary. During this period, he not only honed his pastoral craft but also forged a guiding principle: the Church must be present among the smallest, the suffering, and the forgotten. Tagle's parish visits to the impoverished villages of Cavite left indelible impressions on him, communities scraping by in extreme need, where faith was their sole anchor. He later recounted that it was in those humble settings that he learned the true value of faith, a value that demands courage and sacrifice, not just lofty sermons. Unbeknownst to him at the time, these early experiences would prepare him for an even greater shock. Decades later, confronting the brutal realities of religious persecution worldwide, in the Middle East, Myanmar, and China, whereas his earlier ministry had addressed local suffering, his Vatican assignments exposed him to a far more vast and tragic panorama calling for responses on a global scale. Rooted in this deep humanistic foundation, Tagle has always believed in the power of dialogue and solidarity. Yet after years of witnessing unilateral dialogue's painful failures, Christians still being murdered and imprisoned, churches destroyed, he came to acknowledge that the Church must act more boldly, not merely appeal to goodwill. Thus, it is no surprise that when Tagle announced his Faith and Solidarity initiative, it did not feel like a spur-of-the-moment reaction, but rather the inevitable fruit of a lifetime's journey of learning, service, and pastoral care. That journey began in his own family, where suffering and faith walked hand in hand and a deep sense of responsibility to others was nurtured from his earliest days. Anyone familiar with Tagle's past recognizes that this pivotal announcement was not a sudden shift, but the ripening of a shepherd's conscience, one that has witnessed too much injustice and pain to remain silent any longer. Cardinal Tagle, a leader of profound compassion. If Tagle's family roots and academic formation laid the first foundation for his outlook, it was his years of pastoral ministry and leadership that truly forged in him a distinctive courage, the courage to act out of compassion. That very quality helps explain why, when confronted with the heartbreaking reality of global religious persecution, Tagle did not remain silent but issued a bold new initiative. From the very beginning of his priestly ministry, Tagle refused to stay confined to conference rooms or lecture halls. He went out into the poorest barrios of Cavite, sharing meals with families and listening intently to the painful stories of parishioners. Those early grassroots efforts soon blossomed into large-scale programs once he joined international Catholic organizations. One of his most notable projects was establishing education and vocational training centers across African regions where many Catholic communities face extreme poverty and violence. Rather than simply sending aid, Tagle personally lobbied to found schools and skill centers, convinced that empowering local people through education is more sustainable than any short-term handout. That experience taught him a vital lesson. True compassion is not only about immediate relief but about building long-term opportunities and hope. This principle directly shaped his later Faith and Solidarity initiative, which pairs emergency aid for persecuted Christians with networks for long-term community rebuilding and recovery. Tagle's peacemaking efforts in Myanmar further illustrate his approach. In a country long torn by ethnic and religious conflict, he convened respectful dialogue forums between Catholic leaders and Buddhist monks, helping to diffuse local tensions. He learned that peace cannot be imposed. It must arise from mutual understanding and trust. This Myanmar experience impressed upon him that goodwill alone is insufficient. Durable protection requires sustainable structures guarding vulnerable communities. His commitment to cultural integration in worship also reflects Tagle's pastoral philosophy, that faith must speak the language of the people. Rather than imposing Western models, he championed the use of local languages in liturgy, the incorporation of traditional music, and the celebration of indigenous art within Catholic rites. By doing so, he not only enlivened faith but also honored local identity, strengthening believers at their roots. This very principle underpins Faith and Solidarity, which tailors relief efforts to the unique contexts of each persecuted community, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all model. As president of Caritas Internationalis, the Church's largest charitable network, Tagle led the Share the Journey campaign to raise global awareness of the migrant and refugee crisis. He didn't stop at speeches. He traveled to refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan, sitting alongside families displaced by war and persecution. Witnessing their suffering firsthand cemented his conviction that the Catholic world cannot pray from afar. It must be present, it must act, and it must become a genuine saving hand. All these experiences, interwoven with his innate compassion, have made Tagle a steadfast advocate for the marginalized. Paradoxically, that same stance has drawn criticism from conservative quarters within the Church who fear that excessive softness could weaken the Church's posture against sophisticated and brutal oppressors. His greatest challenge is to sustain his compassionate ideal without sacrificing the resolute strength needed to confront growing threats. It was precisely this realization, that goodwill alone, visits, and awareness campaigns were not enough to save endangered communities, that moved Tagle to respond differently. Recognizing the urgency, he conceived Faith and Solidarity not merely as a pledge but as a full mobilization order for the global Catholic community facing an unfolding disaster. An initiative born of compassion, forged in experience, and unleashed by the pressing demands of reality. The path to the papacy. Although widely praised as a symbol of compassion and hope, Luis Antonio Tagle's journey through the Catholic Church has been far from gilded. Even before issuing his landmark initiative to confront global religious persecution, he faced fierce internal challenges and simmering debates over his leadership abilities, political stance, and the independent thinking required of a papal contender. For years, Tagle has been mentioned as a leading candidate to succeed Pope Francis. His blend of humble character, multilingual communication skills, and international experience make him stand out. Yet that spotlight brings enormous pressure. A papal conclave is a ruthless crucible in which every detail of a candidate's career, temperament, and opinions is scrutinized within the College of Cardinals. The emergence of figures like Cardinal William Goh of Singapore, also Asian, fluent in English, and able to court the Church's conservative wing, has presented a serious counterbalance to Tagle. Goh's more traditional profile appeals to those who view Tagle's openness and progressive image as a liability. Tagle has also had to dispel the notion that he is merely Asia's version of Pope Francis. Many conservative cardinals believe the Church does not need another pontiff devoted to endless dialogue and leniency, but rather someone with a firmer stand, especially in an era of growing political and moral unrest. His pastoral priorities mirror Francis's: concern for the poor, defense of migrants, warnings against populism. To critics, such parallels raise doubts. Can Tagle actually put his own stamp on the Church's future? Or would he simply prolong Francis's legacy? Moreover, Tagle's own record has been picked apart. Perhaps most damaging is his cautious and at times silent approach to Vatican-China relations under Francis. The Vatican signed a controversial 2018 accord with Beijing on bishop appointments, hoping to improve religious freedom in China. Critics like Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong accused the Holy See of selling out the underground church. As prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, whose remit includes China, Tagle made almost no public defense of the agreement, nor strong statements on behalf of persecuted Chinese Catholics. His silence, though defensible as diplomatic prudence, has been read by many as fatal indecision, an unforgivable flaw in any papal hopeful. Questions have also lingered over Tagle's tenure as Archbishop of Manila during Rodrigo Duterte's presidency, infamous for brutal drug war tactics. Under Tagle's watch, Some homilies openly criticized the government, prompting Duterte supporters to accuse the church of overstepping the sacred boundary between church and state. Defenders of Tagle argue that staying silent before injustice would have betrayed the gospel. Whatever the verdict, the controversy tarnished his standing among more conservative cardinals. Finally, Tagle's handling of the sexual abuse crisis in the Philippine church has been subject to fierce scrutiny. While he's never been personally indicted, many felt he lacked the forcefulness needed to discipline errant priests in an age demanding transparency and accountability. The perceived hesitation further fueled doubts about his capacity for decisive global leadership. All these trials and controversies paint a complex portrait of Luis Antonio Tagle, a warm, empathetic leader beloved by the faithful, yet questioned for his firmness, strategic independence, and political courage. Confronted with the stark reality of mounting religious persecution and the limitations of gentle diplomacy, Tagle faced not only a pastoral crisis but a personal reckoning, to prove he can do more than empathize. He must act. Thus, his announcement of faith and solidarity was more than a reaction to a brutal world. It was his answer to years of internal doubts, criticisms, and expectations. It was the moment he stood up and declared, "Luis Antonio Tagle is not merely a successor in waiting, but a true leader ready to confront the greatest challenges of his age." A heart-wrenching discovery. If internal controversies and ecclesial pressures had once left Cardinal Tagle feeling solitary in his pastoral journey, the grim reality he's witnessed in recent years became an irreversible turning point. It wasn't merely the cold statistics of Christians murdered, churches torched, or entire communities eradicated, but the faces, the stories, the heart-rending sobs he saw firsthand on his travels, images that no diplomatic report could erase from his memory. In the Middle East, Open Doors International reported that in 2022, an average of 13 Christians were killed each day for their faith. In Nigeria, attacks on churches have become so routine they barely make international headlines. In Myanmar, after the 2021 military coup, countless minority Catholic communities were ruthlessly hunted down. And in China, despite the Vatican-Beijing Accord, underground parishes loyal to Rome still endure systematic persecution. On those clandestine fact-finding missions, Tagle was no longer the stately cardinal but a powerless witness to the suffering of his fellow believers. He confided to close aides, "I could not sleep after hearing the story of a Syrian mother who lost her entire family for refusing to renounce her faith. I asked myself, how can we still boast of being a global church when we leave them utterly alone?" In those interior moments, Tagle realized that dialogue efforts and reconciliation appeals at international conferences, though necessary, were no longer swift or forceful enough to save endangered lives. This crisis of conscience compelled him to question his own leadership style. Is compassion alone sufficient? Without bold, direct action, can gentleness rescue communities on the brink of despair? Throughout his ministry, Tagle had trusted in the power of dialogue and goodwill. Yet the painful truths he encountered forced him to face an uncomfortable reality. Dialogue cannot occur when one side is being crushed by violence. In such circumstances, silence becomes complicity, not neutrality. This inner turmoil did not erupt overnight but was forged by a long series of experiences, witnessing agony, tearful conversations with refugees, poring over reports drenched in blood and tears. The smiling face of the Asian church began to appear more somber and less jocular at international gatherings. Close collaborators noticed. He listened more, spoke less of optimistic hope, and increasingly stressed the duty of urgent action. The decisive moment came at a closed Vatican meeting in late 2023 when Tagle publicly acknowledged for the first time, "As a church, we have been too slow to respond. We need to do more than prayer, more than goodwill." It was there that the concept of a global initiative to aid persecuted Christians was born. Initially, many cardinals were skeptical, warning of diplomatic fallout that could strain fragile ties with China or certain Middle Eastern governments. But Tagle, for the first time in his career, would not back down. "We cannot bargain over innocent lives." The landmark announcement of the Faith in Solidarity initiative sprang from those very moments. It is not merely a charity program or advocacy campaign but a declaration of fundamental change in how Tagle, and by extension the Catholic Church, engages with a wounded world. That announcement crystallized his profound inner crisis and a journey torn between lofty ideals and stark realities, between a hope for dialogue and the imperative to defend the defenseless. Above all, it stands as the emphatic answer to the heartbreaking truth: if the Church does not rise up for the persecuted, then its preaching on charity and human rights will ring hollowed. On February 14, 2024, during a special session at the Vatican, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle officially announced a global initiative called Faith in Solidarity, a long-awaited declaration by the international Catholic community and a direct response to the painful reality of religious persecution worldwide. Tagle's speech at the session was not long, but it was succinct and powerfully impactful. He did not choose the usual diplomatic niceties. Instead, he went straight to the point. Millions of Christians today live in constant fear simply because of their faith. We cannot continue to stand by. We must act. According to the official announcement, Faith in Solidarity focuses on three main objectives. First, the establishment of an emergency aid network to provide both material and psychological support to Christian communities under attack, from rebuilding churches, schools, and hospitals to launching psychological support programs for war victims. Second, international lobbying efforts to bring issues of religious freedom back to a position of priority at major diplomatic forums such as the United Nations, G7, and G20, holding governments accountable for human rights violations against believers. Third, the launch of a global media campaign to raise public awareness about the crisis of religious persecution, a crisis that, according to Tagle, is not merely a Catholic pain but a wound to all of humanity. Notably, in his announcement speech, Tagle did not shy away from mentioning the Church's past failures. He candidly acknowledged that in many instances, our silence has abetted violence. This statement was striking, rarely spoken by a high-ranking cardinal, and signaled a fundamental shift in Tagle's approach to human rights. No more evasion, no more mere dialogue, but rather proactive assumption of responsibility and action. The initial funding for the project was mobilized from Caritas Internationalis, along with contributions from major Catholic NGOs such as Aid to the Church in Need. However, the true breakthrough of this initiative lies not only in its financial scale or political advocacy. What makes Faith in Solidarity a historic turning point is the philosophy of action that Tagle has set forth. Defending the faith is not solely the task of clergy but a responsibility for the entire community of believers. Every Catholic, from lay people to cardinals, has the duty to stand up for those who cannot defend themselves. Through this initiative, Tagle aims to break the long-standing passivity where people only prayed for persecuted Christians but rarely took concrete action. Another highlight is the commitment to transparency and accountability. Relief activities will be publicly reported through an online reporting system, independently monitored by international human rights organizations. This is a direct response to past criticisms about the lack of transparency in the Church's aid campaigns. It is undeniable that announcing Faith in Solidarity at such a sensitive time, when the Vatican maintains fragile relationships with China and many Middle Eastern countries, is a diplomatically risky move. Tagle is clearly aware of this. In a Q&A session after the announcement, when asked by a reporter whether he feared harming diplomatic relations, he responded, "The lives of the innocent must take precedence over political convenience." In the months following the announcement, the initiative began to take shape. Emergency aid was dispatched to beleaguered communities in Nigeria, Myanmar, and Syria. Advocacy teams engaged with international bodies to highlight the plight of persecuted Christians. Media campaigns were launched to raise awareness and galvanize support among the global Catholic community. Tagle's Faith in Solidarity initiative represents a significant shift in the Catholic Church's approach to religious persecution. It moves beyond passive observation and into active engagement, emphasizing the need for immediate and tangible support for those suffering for their faith. This initiative underscores the Church's commitment to stand with the oppressed, reflecting a profound understanding that faith must be lived out through action, especially in the face of injustice. By launching this initiative, Cardinal Tagle has not only addressed the immediate needs of persecuted Christians, but has also set a precedent for how the Church can respond to global crises. His actions serve as a call to all believers to embody the principles of compassion, justice, and solidarity in their daily lives, ensuring that the Church remains a beacon of hope and support for those in need.